Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which José Victor Giarola will defend the academic thesis, International Labour Mobility, Roots, Returns and Consequences. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you. Dear Pro-Rector, dear Defense Committee, dear family and friends, welcome to the defense of my thesis titled International Labour Mobility, Roots, Returns and Consequences. I want to begin this presentation by briefly outlining its structure that I want to cover with you in the next 15 minutes. First, I want to give you a brief overview of the main question that motivated this research, and also the different angles that I used to answer this question. I also want to give you a brief overview of why conducting such research in the Netherlands was important. With these elements in mind, I will move to the individual chapters of my thesis. And in this part of the presentation, I want to cover three main things with you. First, the questions that I have asked. Second, how I answered those questions. And third, the answer to those questions. Finally, I'll bring everything together in the concluding remarks. All the chapters of my thesis are, in one way or another, related to the overarching question, what are the drivers and consequences of international labor mobility? The angles that I used to answer this question also helped me to title this book. So in chapter 2, The Roots, I explore individual decisions to commute across the border, where the focus is on culture. In chapter 3, The Returns, I explore the decision of individuals to leave the Netherlands, where the main focus here is on financial incentives. In chapter 4, The Consequences, I explore the impact of immigration on the destination country, where the focus here is on the labor market. I use the Netherlands as the main case study for my thesis. The Netherlands is a very receptive country for foreigners, I can tell from personal experience. Almost 1 in 4 individuals residing here in the Netherlands have a migration background. They were either born outside or their parents were born outside the Netherlands. These numbers already give us a hint on why studying such a phenomenon in the country was important. But together with that, I had 3 main features that provided me with a unique opportunity to study human mobility behavior and its consequences. First, through time, history has provided us with linguistic borders that do not overlap with national borders, and this is a feature that I used in chapter 2. Second, the Netherlands offers tax break for immigrants to attract high-skilled migrants to the country, and this was reduced for some individuals, but not for others. And this is precisely what I used in chapter 3. Fourth, the third feature, in which I explore in chapter 4, after the Surinamese independence in 1975, it sparked a sudden and unexpected wave of immigrants to the country, and this is what I used in chapter 4. Moving on to the individual chapters, I want to start a bit with the context here. So we know that globalization has decreased the cost of international labor mobility, and Europe has gone even one step further with its regional integration, the free movement of labor, goods, and services. Yet, removing the institutional barriers have not led to fully integrated labor markets, pointing to us that there might be some other factors at play that can prevent mobility from happening. This is precisely what I use it to motivate the question on this chapter. How does cultural distance between regions affect cross-border commuting? What is new here is that despite the literature, the migration literature had explored culture and its impacts on migration, the literature on cross-border commuting has been a bit more silent, with mainly the effects being measured on differences between languages across the borders. I answer this question with a four simple idea. First, I make use of the fact that historical dialects do not overlap, the border of historical dialects do not overlap with national borders, meaning that even within country, we have dialect differences. Second, I rely heavily on the definition of culture according to the economics literature, which is the transmission of values and beliefs that hardly change over time and are transmitted across generations. I also argue that this transmission of values and beliefs is highly correlated with dialects. So historical dialects are correlated with the transmission of values and beliefs, and more importantly, they do not impose any communication barrier that would prevent mobility from happening today. With those elements in mind, I argue that historical dialects serve as a cultural proxy for the region, and historical dialect differences serve as differences in culture between the regions. The comparison logic here then becomes straightforward. I compare two municipalities that are equally distant, geographically speaking, but that differ in terms of their cultural distance. The first key finding of this chapter is that an increase in cultural distance leads to a decrease in commuting between these regions. In other words, two regions that are equally distant for each other, geographically speaking, people will tend to move where the cultural distance is smaller. Second, at shorter distance, economic factors tend to dominate. But at longer distance, culture becomes a barrier, meaning that people are willing to commute a bit further away if the cultural difference between the regions are smaller. Third, cultural differences act as a barrier even within country, although the effect is much smaller within borders than across border, meaning that borders amplify the effect of cultural distance. In chapter 3, I want to start with an often debate that we often hear, that if tax goes up, individuals would simply leave the country. And this is precisely what motivates the question here. How does taxation affect migration decisions? What is new here is that the literature had explored tax-induced mobility for very high earners and specific groups of individuals, with less evidence on individuals down the income distribution. So this is precisely what we want to unpack here. Is this tax-induced mobility more widespread than previously documented? To study taxation and mobility, one would need a scenario where we have two similar individuals that face different tax conditions while everything else stays the same. However, in the real world, this is very hard to achieve because if taxes goes up or down for a certain group, it usually affects everyone in the same way. The Netherlands offers a tax break scheme since the 1960s to attract high-skilled migrants, and this was revamped in the 2000s to what we know as the 30% rule. In 2012, the government suddenly changed who could receive this benefit, and more importantly, it changed it retroactively. So people already living in the country, but who had relocated from places within the red circle, they were no longer eligible to the 30% rule anymore. And people who were living in the Netherlands, but who had relocated from places outside the red circle, they were still eligible to the 30% rule. The comparison logic here then becomes straightforward. We compare the mobility behavior of individuals who had relocated from within the red circle with individuals that relocated from outside. The first key finding of this chapter is that taking away tax benefits increases the probability of immigrants to leave. And this is true even for people that were in the country for a long time. Coming back to the broader question that we wanted to unpack, is this more widespread across the income distribution? We find that the results are driven by the top 1% of earners and the highly mobile individuals, meaning that individuals down the income distribution, when they are already in the country and face a negative shock in their income, they do not react in the same way. Moving on to chapter 4, I also want to start with a bit of context. So on the one hand, we often hear that immigration can serve to alleviate labor shortages and also help countries to cope with population aging. But on the other hand, there are concerns about labor market competition and integration of these migrants. This is what motivates the question in this chapter. How are natives' labor market outcomes affected by immigration? What is new here is that we explore a sudden and unexpected wave of immigrants, and they arrive in the Netherlands with full labor market rights and relatively strong local language skills. How I answered those questions, how I answered that question, I leverage the fact of the Surinamese independence that happened in 1975, which sparked a wave of immigrants in 1975 and also 79 and 80. These immigrants, they arrived with full labor market rights. It was very sudden, so firms, municipalities, and natives, they could not have anticipated their arrival. I also make use that some municipalities were more exposed to this shock than others, given cultural ties and past migration. So the comparison logic here becomes straightforward. I compare municipalities that were more exposed to the shock with municipalities that were less exposed to the shock. The first key finding of this chapter is that low-skilled natives saw a decline in their employment opportunities with no significant effect for high-skilled migrants. And this is aligned with migration models that would predict that an inflow of immigrants with similar skills would affect natives with similar skills than them. We found no evidence on occupational scores whatsoever. The second key finding of this chapter is that we have circumstantial evidence that language proficiency matters. When I say circumstantial evidence here, I mean that we cannot measure precisely the language proficiency of these immigrants, but historical context tells us that a certain group of immigrants from Suriname had better Dutch language knowledge than the second group of immigrants from there. And when they come here, municipalities receiving more from the first group saw higher negative effects in their employment outcomes. Bringing everything together, from chapter 2, we showed that culture is a barrier to international labor mobility. From chapter 3, we showed that financial incentives also matter for individuals, specifically high earners. And in chapter 4, we showed that under certain circumstances, immigration may have some effects on the local labor market. Together, these chapters help me to conclude that international labor mobility is jointly shaped by economic and non-economic factors that have consequences for the destination country. And this helped me to answer the overarching question, what are the drivers and consequences of international labor mobility? Thank you. I give back the word to the pro-rector.
Thank you very much for your presentation. The opposition will be started by Professor Dr. Didier Fouarge, who was the chair of the assessment committee and who is a professor in dynamics of skill allocation at this university. The floor goes to Professor Fouarge.
Dear candidates, dear Victor, as you are aware, we have quite a number of candidates, PhD candidates at the Institute, and as the head of the department, I never know which PhD thesis I'm going to get to assess, and I was happy I was asked to assess yours as the chair. I think it was a very nice read. It's a very well written, very well thought studies, and it really proves your craftsmanship at scientific research. And proof of that is that one of your chapters already has been published. And my question will be about that published chapter. You would think that reviewers have asked you all the questions, but I think I have a couple more. And my questions all relate to initial conditions. And the first question, some of the questions, by the way, will be yes, no answers, so that's going to be easy. So am I right that in that first chapter you relate mobility, cross-border mobility, to cultural features of the regions?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the kind words. Yes.
You can leave your mic on.
Okay.
So your data, am I correct that your data consists of 35,500 and somewhat people, either Dutch-born or Belgian-born, that commute across the border?
Yes.
Could you remind us what is the share of Dutch-born citizens in that sample?
It's about 40%.
The Dutch-born, 56%, right?
56.
Yes, 56. Yeah. Yes, okay. Yeah, okay. So 56% of your sample are Dutch-born citizens living in Belgium, of which you relate the mobility pattern from Belgium to the Netherlands to the cultural features of the regions in which they live and in which they go and work. Did you consider at any point the initial reason why these people migrated in the first place to Belgium? And whether that is related to economic features or cultural features or whatever other things that would move people. So my worry here is that you're looking at a group of people who might just be going back to the region they originally come from. I would like you to elaborate a bit on that.
Thank you. Yes, highly esteemed opponent. Thank you very much for the question. It's true, it's a high share, and I have thought about that. But the literature tells us that they also choose a place where to go and live based on these cultural ties. Of course, people will not only move to a region based on culture. Culture only adds a layer. These people will move because of an interaction between economic and non-economic factors. In the case they could be going there for family reasons, it's also a family decision. They could be going there for enjoying bigger spaces, lower housing costs. But these are all features that we also try to explore in the chapter 2. So we do some robustness checks, at least like in terms of the housing component, to see if differences in housing prices were explaining the pattern. So if individuals chose to move in Belgium because they would enjoy lower housing prices and commute to the Netherlands to continue enjoy from their economic benefits here. And we show that for specifically the sample of Dutch residents, and this does not drive the result at all. We perform other sorts of robustness checks to account for that, but in the sense, we need to rely more on the literature on why they went there. And it is true that they might have chosen this place because they felt more culturally familiar and they are coming back home, like to commute to a region that they were originally from. It's true. But then the first decision to move to this place was also based on that, because my results show that the cultural difference matters for the commuting. So the first decision for this individual to move to Belgium might also have been motivated by these cultural factors, and also this is driving the results, but only reinforces my results because culture matters for these individuals.
Sure, but it confuses the interpretation of the results. I think we can agree on that, because both the cultural can explain the migration in the first place and the movement back home.
Yes, it's true that we can have like this back and forth. It is true.
So one of the ideas that I had when reading your chapter would be, okay, let's remove then the Dutch sample away from your data, and it's something that you suggest you are doing in table 2.5, where column 2, that's on page 38 of your book, where it looks like you are you're removing the non-Dutch sample from your data, but still the number of observations hardly goes down, and I was worried about something strange there. So I would expect that at least almost 60% of your observations would be gone, but it's not the case. Could you explain that?
Yes, very sharp observation. Yeah. The fact is that when I remove the sample, I'm removing the sample with the higher proportion, right? Like some municipalities where we have higher proportion of Dutch commuting from this municipality A to municipality B. That's the municipalities that I will not consider in the sample, but it's not that I am like dropping entirely the Dutch from the sample. It's just the municipality, because the estimations are at the municipality level, not at the commuting level. So it's municipality pairs. This is the whole estimation that we do. It's on the municipality A to municipality B mobility behavior. So then we need to take only the proportion of municipalities that have higher proportion of Dutch commuting from those regions. And that's why we would see this pattern that you are pointing out.
Yes, thank you. I do have an additional question, but I'm looking at the chair. I think I'm going to keep that for
It'll be a very short question, and supposing also there'll be a short answer.
Well, I will postpone till later so that my colleagues have sufficient time for the questions.
The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Clara Mulder, who was a member of the assessment committee and whose chair is in demography at the University of Groningen. The floor goes to Professor Mulder.
Dear candidate, first of all, my congratulations and also my compliments for this very nice thesis. My question is actually also on chapter 2. In chapter 2, you use historical dialects to measure culture, and I think that is in itself a very nice idea. But you underpin this idea with the argument that historical dialects are uncorrelated with current mobility, except through contemporaneous culture, and that they do not pose communication barriers. And here I'm not completely convinced, because from what I understand, local dialects can be quite persistent. And if that is true, current dialects are associated with historical dialects. And current dialects can form communication barriers. Not speaking the local dialect can lead to feelings of exclusion. So think about those 50% Dutch people who moved to Flanders while keeping their job in the Netherlands. I would think many of them would rather live in a place where they understand their neighbors and don't have any communication barriers. So can you defend your stance that historical dialects are uncorrelated with current mobility except through contemporaneous culture? Or, in other words, can you tell me where my argument about the communication barriers goes wrong?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the kind words and also for the very interesting question. This was, of course, the cornerstone of the identification strategy of this paper. So, of course, I have reflected quite some time on that. We need to understand first what the dialects are capturing here, because it's not only the old ways of speaking, but also it stores centuries of social interaction between people that creates the culture of the region. Not necessarily I'm talking about the individual speaking the dialect or not, but the culture of the region. To substantiate that dialects do not impose any communication barrier, I would need to rely on some numbers that come from surveys that I've read. So one recent study in 2021 shows that 24% of the population in the Netherlands and Belgium are able to speak dialects. So this is a big number. But in closed environments, only 10% of them do. When they These numbers goes to speaking to their children, it drops to 6.7%. But more importantly, in the workplace, this number is 1.5%. So in the workplace, that is exactly what we are looking at here. Only 1.5% reports speaking a dialect. So this would already substantiate for me that it's not serving as a communication barrier nowadays that would prevent mobility. But this would not be sufficient. I would need to do some more tests, and this is what we did, the various robustness checks that we had in terms of including other social interaction channels, such as the differences in religion or the network effect from Belgians in the past living in the Netherlands that might have influenced the culture of the region, but also attract through some enclave networks. And finally, I have done some robustness checks specifically in terms of excluding some specific municipalities. And this was mainly motivated by excluding the urbanicity of the region that could have affected driving the results, but also help us to answer this question because we exclude, for instance, Maastricht and Sittard, where the dialects might be a bit more pronounced in the daily lives, and the results hold. So I hope I have answered your question with this.
Well, you've come quite a way to answer my question. But what I was referring to was actually not communication barriers at the workplace, but communication barriers in the neighborhood. And this is particularly relevant for those, again, the 56% who moved from the Netherlands to Belgium, because I agree with Professor Fouage that the decision that these people have made is probably not working in the Netherlands, but moving to Belgium. And this is where, so when they move to Belgium, it's in their neighborhood where they have the communication barriers.
Yes, but again, as I said, this closed environment is, the numbers are not that big. So we would have even in closed environments, less than 10% of people talking. And what we want, even if they go there, it's not about the working environment, then it's about their decision to leave. They went to Belgium to enjoy, as I said, probably housing prices differences, or even the culture that they feel that it is more close. So they are choosing, they are selecting themselves there. It's true. But they are selecting themselves as well in a place that our results confirm that are the cultural differences between the regions are smaller, because they go to this city and then the results showing the way they do the movement, right? So if the choice was to move there because of cultural differences, or here we are showing that cultural differences are a friction in the labor market because people choose where to live and where to work based on these decisions. I think that's the main message of the chapter.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Stefan Kuhn, who was the third member of the assessment committee and who's an associate professor at this university.
Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Victor, let me first also congratulate you on this big achievement, and let me also say that it was a big pleasure to read your thesis. I mean, I'm personally interested in this topic of labor market mobility, so I was really happy to be invited to be in the assessment committee and to read your thesis in detail. But I also think your empirical analysis is thought through, and you have, for each chapter, you have a clear policy recommendation, conclusions, and that I really appreciate in a good thesis. My question. So I would like to move a bit on to chapter 4. I have a question on chapter 4. Maybe you see it coming. I have a question about your outcome that you use. You use a total, so you analyze the effect of the immigration wave of the immigrants on the local labor markets, and you use as an outcome the total native employment. And here I have two questions. In particular, given the persistence of this effect, so not only a short-run effect when they come in, but it really persistently stays, reduces total native employment. So I was wondering to what degree this effect is explained by just natives moving out, so out migration. And you write this yourself in your thesis, and you say that could be an explanation. So I was wondering, I have two questions. So first, maybe a very short yes-no question, but you can do that later. So the first question is, do you have other outcomes available? Do you have information on the native population? So I see no. So I was presuming, otherwise I would thought you have used it already. So you answered that question already. So my next question, that's my main question, is if not, I was wondering whether you should be maybe a bit more cautious in your policy conclusions when you conclude on, you call it the economic impact of the immigration wave. Because that might then require also, because these natives move out maybe, that could be driving the effect, the negative effect on total employment, native employment. They move out, but they don't disappear. So they move somewhere else. So maybe you need to also analyze spillover effects to have the total effect, the economic impact of this immigration. So they could move, for example, to other regions, to regions who have higher labor demand. So then overall, total native employment could even go up if you have a more aggregate analysis. So I was thinking, wondering whether you would thought about this and whether you can say something about this. Thank you very much.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the kind words and also for the very important question. The choice of going with total native employment, it's driven by mainly two things. One, I didn't have any other data that I could use, but also it's backed in the theoretical framework on the migration literature, specifically on the spatial approach that I used. So comparing municipalities that were less exposed with more exposed, we are recovering here the total effect of immigration. The total effect of immigration is people can lose jobs, go into unemployment, and as you correctly pointed out, they can move out municipalities. So moving out municipalities is not a confounder here, it's a mechanism of adjustment. So the coming back, like the persistence of the shock, going for 10 years, this does not necessarily mean that these guys are unemployed or anything. They can be employed in the comparison municipalities, but this is a mechanism of adjustment from the model, from the perspective of the theoretical framework that we have here. I do agree with you that I probably could be a bit more cautious in the policy recommendation, making these nuances a bit more clear. But the fact that I used the total employment was indeed to recover the total effect. If I use, for instance, natives' employment rate, for instance, we would check the effects conditional on individuals staying in the municipality, because the denominator of this equation would also decrease once individuals leave the municipality. So in that sense, using employment rate here would not allow me to unpack the total effect that was exactly what I wanted to unpack here. In terms of the persistence and also reflecting a bit on what the results might mean, we didn't find any effects on occupational scores, meaning that natives have not upgraded their their occupations in the regions affected. Also, employment rate I could check, but it was not part of, because I was not super certain of the data per se. But it was somehow stable during the period. So I would argue for you that it's more likely that people are indeed moving out municipalities than actually losing jobs. Mm-hmm. I hope I...
Yeah, so very, very quickly only, so I totally agree, it's not a confounder, that was not my question, really a mechanism, but I was wondering whether you looked at this total native employment also in other regions, so maybe where they moved, comparison regions or other regions.
Yeah, that was precisely one of the data that I wanted, was to know if they left place A and went to place B. That data I don't have. So this is something that I could not unpack, and I try even to be transparent to say that I could not unpack the mechanisms behind the negative effects. But it can be that they are moving and then they are appearing even in the control municipalities by increasing there, and that's why we see the negative effect on the treated municipalities, of course.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Paul Muller, who was the fourth member of the assessment committee and who's an associate professor at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. The floor goes to Dr. Muller.
Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Victor, let me also congratulate you on finishing your thesis. I think you've written 3 very convincing chapters. And what I particularly appreciate is also that, given that you're looking at 3 very different dimensions of international mobility, you've really invested in understanding the context in each of these cases. And I think you really demonstrated that in the chapter. So it was a pleasure to read. Now, I have a question about chapter 4 as well. And it's a bit more of a methodological question. Because when I was thinking about estimating the impact of an inflow of a wave of migrants, I think one common way to do that comes to mind is to use a shift share instrument. And you actually mentioned that briefly in the introduction. But then when I read the rest of the chapter, I think you're doing something that somehow relates to this approach, but it's not exactly a shift share instrument, right? So you are dealing with this endogenous choice of where migrants exactly locate within the Netherlands, but not by using an instrument. And so I would like to ask you to reflect on how your approach relates to this shift share instrumental approach, and also to motivate why you've opted for this approach and not the other one.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the kind words and also for the very important question. This was, of course, like one of the main thoughts that I had to deal with when developing this chapter. Why not to use the shift share? I would say that there are 2 main explanations. The first one is more backed on the methodology per se, and the other one is more to where this paper fits in the literature. I will start with the methodology one. There is a recent development in the shift share literature specifically, and we can have identification here either from the shift or from the shares, right? Having it from the share would need that the share is not correlated with the outcomes. So they chose the destination not based on these regions being booming. So they went there because employment opportunities were good or anything. And in this sense, this is coming like the identification from the share. We also use reliability. And the identification from the shift would be that we have like sufficient independent shifts happening in the labor market, where by the law of large number, we would have this to be exogenous. So there are these 2 ways of identification from the shift share. I do not have many independent shocks. I only have 1. So that's what motivates a red, like my choice go for a difference in difference. Also, even in the paper where they are arguing about the share being exogenous, it is written that if you have a pre-period where you can test pre-trends, then it's just a difference in difference. And that's why I also rely on that. Basically, using a difference in differences, I can test the parallel trends in the period before the shock and after the shock. And for that reason, I also motivated the choice for going for a difference in differences. Finally, the difference in differences, according also to the literature, is the one that would recover the total effect of immigration shocks in the pure spatial design as the ones that we have. The second reason, as I mentioned, it's also a bit on where the paper fits in the literature. we do have some episodes of migrants coming to the country of destination, flying from wars or just some wave of immigrants, and they normally do not have the same language skills required in the destination country. The case of the Suriname is different because they do have language skills when they come to the Netherlands. They do speak Dutch. And using the shift share would mean that I needed to have not just the shares that I instrumented using the religions as well, from the different groups, from the different ethnic groups in the share, but even the shift, I would need to know where each of these guys are going. And with the differences, I try to overcome that by just calculating the share in the previous period, and this is the intensity of treatment, and then we see the results after. I hope I have answered your question.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Lex Borgans, whose chair is in labor economics and social policy. The floor goes to Professor Borgans.
Thank you. Dear candidate, I also would like to congratulate you with your very interesting thesis. And for my question, I would like to go back to chapter 2. And my specific question is about the French-speaking people in Belgium. And it has two dimensions. The first is that nowadays is a very strict division between the Flemish part and the French-speaking part of Belgium. But that is quite recent. And so the spread of the French language has been more fluid in the past. For example, in Brussels is of course the best example. Many people there speak French. But in the past also in a city like Leuven, many people are French speaking. And nowadays still you see if you go to Knokke, that is very hard to get around with your Dutch. And even in Maastricht, the elite was speaking French, like in the early half of the previous century. So the first part of my question is, to what extent did these French-speaking people also influence the culture of these regions, and to what extent does that affect your estimates? And the other part is that nowadays, the borders are even changing. So now in Brussels, the fraction of people who speak French has gone up quite dramatically, and there are also many people living in the municipalities outside Brussels. There also you have sometimes majorities of French-speaking people. Here, very close to Maastricht, we have the Voerstreek. There are also many French-speaking people. So the second part of the question is, to what extent does the fact that some of your observations are people who are French-speaking rather than Dutch-speaking influence your estimates? That's my question.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the kind words and for the very interesting question. Indeed, the French-speaking people would be present in the data. That's no doubt. The French-speaking regions are not, so we exclude them. So we are talking about only the Flanders and the Dutch regions. So in terms of cultural dialects from those French regions in Belgium, they are not included. But I agree with you, they influence, as I said, in what does cultural dialects, what does historical dialects actually represent? They are centuries of social interaction stored in the ways we communicate. So precisely people from the French-speaking parts would have influence, but this is also captured in the dialects of the region per se. So we are not talking about the composition of commuters, we are talking about the differences in culture between these two regions that might have been influenced in the past by this whole historical context, but it does not translate in any differences from the interpretation, in the sense that it's the culture of the region that matters, and how far it is from the place that they are going. So in the case of Brussels, we have many French speakings. We even have plenty of international people there that do not speak the dialect or do not have anything with the dialect, but they are, in a way, living in a system where these communications from the past, the way the norms, the behaviors, and the attitudes were formed for the region itself that is within the Flanders region still, like even Brussels is within the Flanders region. We also try to deal with that by excluding some big centers to see if they were driving the results or not, and they were not. So this is, they have influence. I completely agree with you that they have influenced the culture of the region, but I would argue that they are not influenced the results, because the results are the differences between the regions. We are doing at the municipality level, the analysis we are not doing at the commuter level. So what matters is like what is the difference between the regions per se. I hope I have answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Martin Carré, whose chair is in industrial organizations at this university. The floor goes to Professor Carré.
Thank you. Dear candidate, I consider myself somewhat of an outsider in this group because I'm more in business studies, but nevertheless I've been more times in a kind of labor economics jury, and I can read very well this type of language because I also did a lot of regional studies investigations. I want to ask a question, chapter 4. It's a beautiful chapter, and it is about people coming to the Netherlands. Well, in fact, they were Dutch because they came from Suriname, but they came to this country of tulips and windmills. So that's beautiful on the cover. Of course, the Netherlands is more than only tulips and windmills, so that's very much Holland. But the rest of the Netherlands is less tulips and maybe less windmills, but nevertheless, it's a good characteristics of our country. So chapter 4, and there is a proposition connected to that, and there's proposition number 6. And I ask one of the two paranymphs, I hope they are prepared, to read proposition number 6 aloud on the microphone, hopefully.
Yes, proposition number 6. Political backlash to immigration is frequently shaped by perceptions, narratives, and information at least as much as by realized economic impacts.
Thank you. So, interesting. It's not that I necessarily disagree with this proposition, but you put it down, and I guess for a reason, to also be willing to discuss this kind of topic. In the proposition, I don't know what the word information exactly means, because, well, that's very broad, but of course I can relate to the other things, perceptions, narratives, and so on. So there are reasons why people would be kind of hesitant towards newcomers into a country. There can be all kind of reasons. And but the reasons maybe in the late 1970s could also be quite different from nowadays. I think they are. And so I can still remember the late 1970s. Well, I was born in 1968, and it was a typical period because it was not only a period in which indeed there was the inflow of Suriname people, which was not so drastic, by the way, for the Netherlands, because it was only 1% of the Dutch population in the end. So it was enormously drastic for Suriname as a country, of course, but for the Netherlands, not that much as a national scale. So I don't think there was too much, for example, fear of our culture being affected or so in that sense, which you sometimes hear nowadays, because the percentages of immigrants have lately been a little bit higher than in those days. But it was also a period of increasing unemployment. So that was a little bit different than nowadays also. In the Netherlands, we basically have have not really an unemployment problem for a very long time already. And so something like immigrants threatening our jobs is currently not so much of an issue. So if people talk about immigrants nowadays, they talk about, oh, they take our houses because we have a housing issue, or they may affect our culture, because the number of immigrants is a bit higher than in those days. And of course, politics is also quite different, because in the 1970s, it was still the politics of the grand stories, the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, the liberals, and nowadays it's a little bit more populist. So in that sense, we live in a quite different time than in the 1970s. So that's an interesting thing, is to what extent do these results for the Suriname immigration flow have kind of still relevance for us today, isn't it, that we live in a completely different world? But one thing that I started to wonder about is also, it is the case that there was a bit fear, maybe in the late 1970s, that immigrants would be taking jobs because of the rising unemployment rate. The youth unemployment rate was really rising quite steeply in those years. So there will be something like, well, okay, you want to avoid that the immigration is going to affect certain type of local economies in which there's, for example, an unemployment problem. Now, you want to discuss maybe a bit politics. Would you now, for example, out of your results, which had to do with the immigration of the Suriname people, would you now say, okay, it would be best for the government, well, we have a new government nowadays, that they spread the immigration, because that's always a bit of a political debate, not so much on population numbers, but on the local unemployment or low-skilled employment rate, in the sense that you want to place immigrants in those places in which there is not a lot of low-skilled employees, or in which there is a high unemployment rate, because that will lead to issues. So place them in the rich municipalities in which there is a lot of high-skilled employment and no unemployment at all. Would that then be your political advice in the end? Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the kind words and for the very interesting question. I do argue that in terms of like how these results can still be relevant for us today, I think nowadays we see often more waves of immigrants, but for diverse reasons, like moving to other countries as refugees from war or climate shock. So the amount of people moving to other countries to search for a better life, it's still going on. So I would still say that this is relevant. In terms of this, the results of this chapter, the Surinamese independence was one of the kind, in the sense that they arrived here with full labor market rights, so they could work. And they also have Dutch local language, so they could integrate a bit easier. But there are studies, and going back to your question, what would be the best option nowadays for policymakers to place these immigrants in places where you have like a labor shortage, or how would you do that? I would argue yes, precisely. We do not have, at least not to my knowledge, evidence on the Netherlands on the immigration, especially low-skill immigration, feeling some labor shortage, but we do have some evidence, for instance, in Denmark, showing that the prospects of these individuals coming to the country and going to the regions that are in need of them to work, it's a good policy, because it helps them to integrate, it helps them to generate income, and also help the region with filling the labor shortage. Also, in terms of integration for the policymakers, I think it's very important for policymakers to realize that these integration policies can help them to have better prospects through time, but not just immigrants per se, but also the native population, in the sense that if they are better integrated, they can communicate better, they can perform better in team groups. So this is another policy the policymakers could explore on how to integrate these people, not just by providing them training to fill some labor shortage, but also to integrate in the local culture, in the local context. I hope I have answered your question.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Julia Reinold, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Erasmus Universiteit Rotterdam. The floor goes to Dr. Reinold.
Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Victor, also my compliments on the successful completion of your dissertation. It was a pleasure to read, really. You make original contributions to our understanding of what drives labor mobility. Especially I appreciate also you going beyond the traditional economic drivers of mobility. You use sound methods and are able to identify causal effects, which is not always the case in migration research and especially in the literature on the drivers of migration. So my compliments, really. Especially, we still don't know so much about policy effects on migration outcomes. Results are rather mixed. And I think the effect of tax policy is one of the few areas where we really have such clear results, also thanks to you. But of course, I also have to ask you a question, and it relates to Chapter 3. Recently, I read a study from the Institute for Employment Research in Germany, where based on a large panel study called the International Mobility Panel of Migrants in Germany, they identified that actually tax burden in Germany is one of the most important reasons cited by migrants for considering or planning to leave Germany again. So my question is, to what extent do you think that such a tax scheme like the 30% rule here would also work in other countries? And in particular, what would you recommend the German government to do if they were to introduce a similar scheme? And should they also include the top earners? Because I'm not entirely convinced that these are the people that we really need in our labor markets today. Thank you.
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the kind words and for the very interesting and relevant question. In terms of tax scheme, like what we have shown is that the 30% rule was actually very important to retain migrants. Especially, it's important to retain the top 1% of earners. Once they lose the benefit, they leave the country. This is one margin of response, right? We have in the literature also present here the highly esteemed opponent paper that shows that the 30% rule was actually very important as well to attract migrants to the country. And for that specific cohort, we also show that it was very important to retain them in the country. So to attract and retain these immigrants in the country, the 30% rule was very important. And we also showed that for the top 1%, it matters for them to stay. And evidence from other countries also showed that it's also important to attract these guys. Evidence from our chapter as well is that individuals from the top 1% and highly mobile individuals, they also go to places where these tax breaks are offered after. So this tax shopping behavior that they have is precisely what shows that these tax benefits matter for them. The question then turns on like how important it is to have these people like in the country, right? In terms of the ones down the income distribution, I would argue that it's very important because firms, they do not have higher incentives to hire abroad. It's not that the 30% rule that makes them hire abroad. The 30% rule is just a mechanism for them to do so because the bureaucracy for them to hire someone from abroad, it's actually higher than applying to the 30% rule. So if they had people in the Dutch labor market that they could fill the positions with the Dutch residents, they would have done so. But no, they hire abroad because they need. So in a way, it's showing that at least for some sectors, and then we have finance, IT, where this rule is highly used, where it's very important. So having the 30% rule is important for attracting, retaining, and they have benefits for the country. On the top 1%, they also come with some management experience that they can drive productivity, innovation of the firm. So I would also argue that having those guys here in the country is also important. Coming back also to your final point on what would I advise other countries to do, I think I do discuss that in the conclusions on how we should have a sort of coordination mechanism at the Euro level, because in a sense, when governments take the decision to repeal the 30% rule, for instance, they are not acting in the vacuum, right? So people will move. And if we start with this on a...
Please feel free to conclude your response.
Thank you. So just finishing this, so in a way, governments are not acting in the vacuum. So like mobility responses are there and we documented, right? So a certain level of coordination at the EU level where you put like minimum tax benefits that you can offer, like maximum durations. It's not to say that you should like take out the whole flexibility of governments to act, but just some sort of guidelines that could help them to avoid a race to the bottom that we would call. Thank you.
Thank you.
José Victor Giarola, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed, and the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room. José Victor Giarola, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense, and in view of its positive verdict, and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Curvers is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom, and I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
First of all, Victor, do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, José Victor Cremonesi Giarola, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Dear Dr. Victor, on behalf of both Professor Hans Smeets and myself, I would like to congratulate you on your well-deserved PhD from Maastricht University. We have been delighted to have you as a PhD student over the past 6 years, but we are even happier and very proud that the journey we began in 2019 has now been completed with fantastic results. Not only the thesis, but also your very convincing defense. Congratulations also to your family. Your parents must be very proud to now have 2 doctors as children, which begs the question, who is the real doctor? Your sister, who is a medical doctor, or you, who has written a doctoral thesis? What started with an online job interview, because you were in Brazil at the time, as far as I remember, turned into a big journey to Maastricht. You already knew Europe from when you studied economics in Paris, and you also visited the Netherlands before settling in Maastricht. Your thesis is about international labor mobility, something you embody yourself, having been born and raised in Brazil and having studied, lived and worked in Paris, Brussels and Maastricht. It was a little disappointing for both Hans and me that you moved away from Maastricht. The more progress you made with your thesis, the further away you moved. First to Eindhoven, which was somewhat understandable because your great love PSV is based there, and they also have some kind of carnival there. But when you moved from the south to the Netherlands, to Utrecht, we really didn't understand. Perhaps the reason for your move was that in accordance with what we call our dialect paper, your Brazilian dialect is more familiar to the Utrecht dialect than to the Maastricht and Eindhoven dialect. We don't know. A lot happened during this period. To name just a few events, the COVID-19 crisis had a huge impact, especially because it became even more difficult to collect data from the Dutch tax authorities. Another event, you became a PSV rather than an MVV football fan. You did a 5-month internship at the European Commission. You moved in with your partner Isabella and got engaged. And you got your current job at the Economic Policy Research Institute. During these years, the discussions with you and collaboration on our joint research were very interesting and fruitful. You were always very polite and kind to us, and all other ROA colleagues. Always started your emails with something like, "I hope you are doing well," and almost always seemed to be in a good mood. It was also nice to see you and Hans got on so well and had a lot of fun together. For example, talking about football and about beers, I understand. I was often surprised by the creativity in your thinking, particularly when you are addressing issues of causality in the research questions and data collection. In my opinion, you are an excellent economist, highly trained in various methodologies and at the same time very practical and interested in social issues. You had to go through rigorous review procedures for various journals. For the Journal of Economic Geography, we received a major revision to submit our dialect paper with a warning from the editor that we might not succeed in getting it published in his journal. But thanks to our collaboration and above all your perseverance, we succeeded. For the 30% paper, as we call it, we and our co-author Olivier Marie submitted the article to several top 5 economic journals, and at one point we were very close to publication. This shows how difficult it can be and how long it can take to get economic articles published in the best economic journals. It also gives me confidence that you will have a great career because of your excellent academic skills and your perseverance. In addition, and more importantly, I'm convinced that you will have a great life with your family, friends, and your partner because you are a kind and wonderful person. I wish you all the best.
Dear Dr. Giarola, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you, your family, your friends, with the degree that you have acquired. And I would like to thank the members of the degree committee for their contribution to this. With this, I'm about to close this session. We'll take pictures on the main stairs in the hall. We'll most probably be talking with one another just afterwards.